Chapter 4. The Aufwader. Janet cradled Ben in her arms and held him tightly. The boy mumbled under his breath and opened one bleary eye. Janet had left the door to her room ajar, and over her shoulder she could see onto the landing. It was dark and empty. "Good," he breathed with relief. "They've gone." "Are you all right, Ben?" his sister asked gently. He nodded and wiped his forehead. Janet looked at him to make sure, then pulled her large blue bag from underneath the bed. "Come on," she said firmly. "We're leaving. Go and fetch your stuff." Ben stared miserably at her. He had done it again. Yet another chance had been ruined by his behaviour. He pouted and rubbed his eyes, for he had liked Whitby. "Where will we go now?" he asked in a small voice. "I don't know, and I don't care," the girl fumed. "But we're not staying here a minute longer." He ran into his own room, and the tears started to fall. Janet had not told him what she had seen downstairs, so he assumed she was angry with him. In the parlour, Aunt Alice was shooing her guests out. "Hurry up," she cried frantically. "No, leave that, Edith. I'll put it away, thank you." "Adolescent histrionics," Mrs. Joyster remarked dryly, as she went into the hall and took her coat off the peg. "Girls like that are only seeking attention." "Well, I'll make sure she receives some then," Aunt Alice barked back at her. "Wasn't worth leaving Eurydice and her little babies," grumbled the whiskered Miss Stroon. "Did I tell you she had 3 of the little beauties?" "Chew!" sneezed Edith Weathers as she squeezed by. Miss Boston shepherded them out the front door, ignoring the protests and grumbles. She was the undisputed leader of the ladies' circle, and her authority was absolute. Mrs. Banbury Scott was not at all pleased, though, as, scone in hand, she trundled out of the yard and looked for her Bentley. Aunt Alice closed the front door and gazed uneasily up the stairs. This was going to be extremely difficult. Janet emptied the contents of her chest of drawers onto the bed and stuffed her clothes into the bag. Her thoughts were a jumble of confused strands. What was she to do now? Where could she and Ben go? It was all very well to run away if you had somewhere to run to, but they had nowhere. The hostel was out of the question. No way would she go back there. The Rodders wouldn't let them anyway, the mean old crow. "May I come in?" Miss Boston stood timidly on the landing, with her hands clasped to her chest. She looked like a small child, waiting outside the headmaster's office. Janet continued packing without looking up. "It's your house," she muttered in a dull tone. Aunt Alice glanced at the large bag which the girl was filling. She clutched at the doorframe and asked fretfully, "But my dear, what are you doing? Are you going somewhere?" "You lied to me," Janet snorted. "You let me think you wanted me here. How long would it have been before you involved Ben in your dodgy games?" She threw the last of her clothes in the bag and whirled round to face the old woman. "I could report you, you know. Tell the Sunday papers or something. They'd love this, wouldn't they? Imagine the headlines. Coven of geriatric witches exposed." Miss Boston stared at the carpet, thoroughly abashed. "Yes, I suppose I deserve that," she said meekly. "What I have done is unforgivable. I'm sorry." "Too late for that now. You frightened Ben half to death." The old lady raised her eyebrows eagerly. "Really? Why, what did he see?" "You don't stop, do you?" Janet gasped incredulously. "You just don't care. He might have been sent round the twist, and all you're interested in is what sort of ghosts he saw." Aunt Alice shook her head. "That isn't true," she denied vehemently. "Of course I'm concerned." At that moment, Ben appeared. In his arms he carried a bundle of belongings, and his cheeks were stained with tears. He gazed up at Miss Boston miserably. "Why don't you like us any more?" he asked in a tremulous voice. "I don't want to go." She yelped as though wounded. "Oh, but I do like you, Benjamin," she cried, "and I don't want you to leave." "Give me your stuff, Ben," Jeanette said coldly. The boy looked from Aunt Alice to his sister, his unhappy face betraying his emotions. He was torn between love and loyalty to Janet and reluctance to leave the one place he had felt at home since the death of his parents. Miss Boston saw his pain and decided that enough was enough. "Go back to bed, Benjamin," she told him kindly. "We'll sort this out." Janet glared at her and was about to speak, but Aunt Alice puffed herself up and spoke in such a forceful voice that for a moment the girl was startled into silence. "Let Benjamin go," she instructed firmly. With one hand on his shoulder, she guided the boy out of the room, then closed the door and turned to his sister. "What right have you got—" Janet began. But now it was Miss Boston's turn to speak. "I have every right," she declared. "I am now legally responsible for both of you, and if you think I am going to let you run off in the middle of the night, you're not the clever girl I thought you were." She jutted her chins out determinedly, daring the girl to disagree. Janet sat down heavily on the bed and sobbed bitterly. Aunt Alice's expression softened, and she sat next to her. "Let me explain, Janet dear," she said gently. "When I was a young girl, not much older than yourself, I saw things I didn't understand. Like Ben, you mean?" "Exactly so. But at the time, my mama forbade me to mention them. In those days, children were not spared the rod, and I soon learned to save my poor hands from the cane by ignoring what I saw." She stared for a moment at her palms, remembering the wheals that had once marred them. Then she thrust her hands under her knees. "A gift such as I possessed goes into decline if neglected," Aunt Alice resumed sadly, "and I neglected it for many years." "So what were you doing downstairs?" asked Janet, totally unmoved. Miss Boston heaved a great sigh. "I do wish you'd be a little less prickly, Janet dear. I'm afraid that what you saw downstairs was one of my attempts to regain the gift. The circle meets every month for what Mrs. Banbury Scott jokingly calls spirits and scones. More often than not, it ends up just as a little social chit-chat. Our dear departed don't always feel inclined to come through, you know." "You just had a good turnout tonight, though, didn't you?" Janet put in. "Practically a full house." The old lady clucked uncomfortably. "You must believe me, child. I'd already made my mind up that tonight's little get-together would be the very last." "So you say." "I swear it on my life, Janet. There will be no more meetings of the circle." Janet remained wary and distrustful, but she realized there were no other options open to her. "All right," she said slowly. "We'll stay, provided there are no more spirits and scones." "There won't be." The old lady brightened, confident that the situation had been resolved. "Well, it's time you got some sleep now," she smiled, getting to her feet and crossing to the door. Janet did not reply. As she left, Miss Boston hesitated. "Oh, and by the way," she added, "you need 13 for a coven, and I prefer the term wise woman. Good night, dear." A wild and windy Monday kept most of the tourists indoors, to the irritation of the landladies and to the profit of the arcade owners. The north wind blasted in off the sea, and even the buildings seemed to shiver and shrink closer into the cliffs. In the afternoon, Ben went for a walk alone. Janet was brooding in her room, and he sensed the tension between her and Aunt Alice, but at least they were staying in Whitby. He stood on the church steps and leant on the handrail. Set into the wall of one of the houses below, he noticed 3 large ammonites just above the lintel. Ben grinned. It was just as the story had said. He looked up at the gulls and stretched out his arms like wings. After drawing a deep breath, he squawked, mocking them as loudly as he could, and tore up the steps. When he reached the top, Ben threw himself on the grass around the gravestones and rolled over so he could see the sky. A miserable collection of people was mooching around the church, and he heard the dull drone of their voices, although he did not sit up to see them. One of the group was evidently a child, a boy. He was asking questions to what Ben presumed was his mother, and she was answering with a voice full of irritation. Curiously, he turned on his side just to make sure. There they were, trailing along the path, a family of 3, and all dressed in totally inappropriate clothes for this sort of weather. They were obviously trippers who had not come prepared for anything other than sunshine. The father was walking a little ahead with his hands thrust into his pockets, and the mother was trying to control her flapping summer dress with one hand while clinging onto her son with the other. The boy was roughly around Ben's age. He wore red shorts and his legs looked pinched and cold. An extra strong gust caught the woman unawares, and she shrieked as her skirt blew right up. The son seized his chance and escaped from her clutches. Into the forest of gravestones he scarpered, and, squealing his name at the top of her shrill voice, his mother chased after him. The boy knew his freedom would be short-lived, so he looked round for something to take his temper out on. "Get lost, Dracula!" he bawled, raising his foot and giving the nearest headstone a mighty kick. His mother screeched as she snatched him up once more. "Don't you ever do that again," she yelled. "If your father catches you, he'll cripple you. Now show some respect." And with that, she slapped his legs, and the boy let loose a dreadful howl. Ben winced. That must have hurt, especially with it being so cold. He lay back on the grass once more and found himself thanking his stars that he and Janet had never been sent to people like them. The family passed along the path nearby. The boy stared unhappily at Ben, shamed by the red mark which glowed on his leg. Chewing a piece of grass, he contemplated the previous night's happenings. He was not exactly sure why Janet had been so cold towards Aunt Alice that morning, but it must have something to do with what he had seen. If only he was like everyone else. The evening was drawing in, but he had no desire to go back yet, especially if the atmosphere had not lifted. He propped himself up on his elbows and looked down at the harbour. A fishing boat was sailing out to sea, defying the rough waves. Ben remembered that he had still not visited the lifeboat museum and promised himself that treat for tomorrow. His gaze followed the progress of the boat as it sailed out to sea. As he turned his head to do so, something startled him. On one of the tomb slabs sat a small figure. It was silhouetted against the horizon, and, until his eyes adjusted to the light, Ben could not make it out. It was as large as a child, and wore a dark blue fishing jersey. A battered canvas bag was slung over one arm, and poking out of it was a slimy bundle of seaweed. The head of the figure was hunched deep into its shoulders, and the neck of the thickly knitted garment had been pulled up over its ears. Its back was turned to Ben, so he could not see the face. To make identification even more difficult, a black woolen hat obscured most of the head. A thick tangle of brown hair fluttered in the wind below the wide turn-up of the hat, suggesting perhaps the figure was a girl. Something buzzed inside his head. Ben shook himself and rubbed his eyes. He was not certain, but he thought it was one of his visitors. The boy was at once afraid and yet greatly interested. Although he remembered the horror of last night, he realized he had only been terrified because there were so many of them. Ben continued to stare until curiosity overpowered him. Very quietly, he got up and stretched. With the tip of his tongue pressed over his top lip in concentration, he stepped over the grass towards the tomb where she sat. Closer and closer he crept, his heart pounding. Then, just as he came within reach, the figure moved and turned her face full on him. Ben froze. He had never beheld anything like it before. The creature was not human. Her face was like soft leather. The nose was large and upturned, with a small mouth like a crescent moon, and cheeks burnt brown by the wind. Yet it was her eyes that transfixed the boy. They were as big as his fists, and as grey as the stormy sea, and the wrinkles which framed them spread about her brow like ripples on the shore. They faced each other in silence, but the space between them was electrified. Ben gulped. The other kept her fathomless eyes upon him. She too swallowed nervously, but as a cornered animal might. Finally her lips parted, and she spoke. Her voice held the cry of the gulls and the lulling of the sea. "You see me, human child?" she said simply, and something close to a smile hovered above her mouth. Ben could only nod in reply. The creature averted her eyes, and he felt as though invisible chains released him. "Never have I met one with the sight," she said, breaking into a grin. Who are you? He stammered at last. I'm Nelda, she answered teasingly. But that was not your meaning. She lifted her eyes again, and the sea stirred in the very heart of them. Can a human child understand? She asked herself. For a moment she considered the situation, then shrugged. I am a wanderer of the shore, she told him. Our folk dwell by the sea, and have done so long before your kind came. Ben frowned. But why haven't I heard of you before? Nobody's ever mentioned you to me. Nelda smiled. That is because man no longer remembers or believes in us. We are figures of legend now, and it is better so. She brushed the wild, unkempt hair off her face and looked down at the harbour. We fade away, she muttered darkly. Aufweider was the name you once gave to us, but who now recalls it? Very few, I think. Ben still did not understand. Shaking his head, he asked, But why have we forgotten? Surely people must see you when... Even as he said the words, he realized what she meant. Only people like him could see them. Oh, he uttered slowly. She laughed, swinging her legs off the tomb and leaping to the ground. Oh, that's right, human child, Nelda gurgled. No one will believe you if you tell them. They shall think you mad. The strange creature prepared to leave, but Ben caught her arm. With a shock, he realized she was real and alive, not one of his visitors at all. Don't go yet, he pleaded. My name's Ben. The Aufweider considered him for a moment, and a smile flickered over her face again. Why should I linger here? She asked mildly. Already I have dared much just to speak with you. Our races are apart, Ben. Yours is strong and has conquered the world, but the tally of our years might soon come to an end. Nelda stared out to sea and hung her head as if overwhelmed by some terrible grief. I must go, she said in a husky voice. Ben did not want her to leave just yet. There were so many questions ricocheting round his head. How many of her kind were there? Where did she come from? And would he see her again? Nelda began to walk down the path, and he could think of nothing that would make her stay. He felt useless and watched helplessly as she approached the steps. Then, as she turned to nod farewell, the boy caught sight of a raw emotion in her eyes and was jolted out of his dumbness. There was something troubling her. Quickly, he cupped his hand round his mouth. Won't you tell me what's the matter? He shouted after her. The departing figure hesitated on the steps. Nelda lifted her head, and the face which had shown those teasing smiles was now brimming with sorrow. Ben ran up and put his hand on her shoulder. Can't I help? He asked. Nelda studied him. How could a human child know her pain, she wondered. Perhaps the elders were wrong, and some of them could be trusted. What age do you reckon me? She asked him suddenly. Ben shrugged. He was not very good at guessing people's ages, and it usually upset them when he got it wrong. He looked at the network of wrinkles which scored her face. If it wasn't for those, he would have assumed she was a child too. She was only as tall as he was. Could she be 50? 60? He plumped for the former, because it was more complimentary. I am 70 of your years, Nelda corrected him. Yet I am the youngest of my tribe. A mere whelp I am to them, though I have lived in this world since before your father was born, and you and I are probably of similar age to our bloodkin. I haven't got a father, Ben told her. He's dead. A quick succession of expressions passed over Nelda's face. She was wondering whether she could stay just for a little while longer. No one need know. So be it, she said aloud once the decision had been made. Let us talk, you and I. She led him over the gravestones to where the cliff sloped grassily down to the backs of houses. There they sat down. Delicious-smelling kipper smoke came from one of the chimneys, and the wind seized it eagerly, scattering the tantalizing scent over the town. Nelda nuzzled her chin into the wide neck of her jersey and embraced her knees until she was curled up like an urchin. Ben waited patiently. He was content to just sit there, breathing the kippery air next to the remarkable Aufwader. A middle-aged couple trudged up the church steps while he waited. They smiled at him pleasantly as they passed by. Ben bit his lip with excitement. They had not seen Nelda. It was all a marvellous secret, and one which he realised had to be kept. If he told his sister, she might have another argument with Aunt Alice and threaten to leave again. No, he would tell no one about Nelda. "I fear my father is dead also," she said suddenly. Ben started and glanced at her. "Don't you know?" he asked. She put her head on one side and replied thoughtfully, "My heart knows, and that is enough." Ben did not understand. How could she not know whether her father was alive or dead? Nelda saw his confusion. "My father has not been seen for over 2 weeks now," she explained. "Doesn't mean he's dead, though." Nelda pressed the fingers of her left hand against her brow and sighed. "Oh," she began, "it does not end there. My uncle is missing also." Ben nibbled his lip uncomfortably. He was not sure what to say. "I'm sorry," he murmured quietly. At this, Nelda snorted. "Pah! I care not for him. He is nothing to me." She paused to spit on the ground with disgust. "Like the scum which now floats on the water he is," she said, shuddering. "None like Silas, my uncle. The elders only suffer him for the sake of my aunt. No, my belief is that Silas has done a black deed. I fear he has murdered my father." There was a silence in which Nelda glared at the sea. Ben opened his mouth in shock. "Murder? She must be mistaken. Are you sure?" he stuttered feebly. "Can't they have just, gone away?" "My father would not have left like that," she said firmly. "On the last day they were seen, they quarrelled. No one knew what the argument was about. My father would not tell me. Never have I seen him in such a dark mood. No, he is dead. I feel it. And my uncle hides in some dark corner, the craven mudworm." In part, Ben understood what she was going through. Human or not, she still had feelings. "Both my parents were killed in a crash," he said simply. "But at least I knew they were really dead and not just missing. It must be awful not to know." "Then we are both orphans, Ben," she breathed. "I never knew my mother. She died when I was born, as do all mothers now." Nelda fell silent, as though she had said too much, then squinted at the pale sun. It was time for her to go. She got to her feet and said, "I must return to my people." "Do you have to?" Ben protested. "Can't you stay just a little bit longer?" The smile pulled at the corners of her crescent mouth once more. She liked this human boy. There was an understanding between them. Would it hurt if she met him again? Nelda wondered. But what if such a meeting was discovered by the elders? Mixing with humans was strictly forbidden. The penalty for disobeying one of the prime laws was exile from the tribe, and Nelda did not want to risk that. It would be better if she left now and stayed in the caves for a while. Yet she looked down at Ben and rashly said, "Tomorrow, when the sun is as now." And with a quick, desperate look, Nelda dashed to the steps and sped down them. Ben stayed where he was. Now that she was gone, he doubted if Nelda had ever existed. Had he imagined it all? He remained seated for some time, staring at the harbour. Everything seemed so normal and everyday now, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But a slow grin spread from ear to ear. He had touched another world that nobody knew anything about. The boy could hardly wait for the next day.